For over 2,400 years, Socrates has been praised as the father of philosophy, a fearless seeker of truth and justice. But what if the story we've been told hides a darker reality? Beneath the noble image lies scandal, political intrigue, and ideas so dangerous they shook Athens to its core. Why did the Athenians truly condemn him to death? And what secrets did ancient historians choose to leave out? In this video, we're uncovering the hidden truths and exploring the dark side of ancient Greece's greatest philosopher. Get ready to see Socrates as you've never seen him before. Let's dive in. Few names shine as brightly in the annals of Western thought as that of Socrates. Draped in a mystique of wisdom and moral courage, he has long been painted as a noble martyr for truth, a philosopher who chose death over abandoning his principles. For centuries, he has stood as a symbol of reason, virtue, and intellectual freedom. Yet behind the marble statue lies a far more complex and troubling human story. Was Socrates truly the pure-hearted seeker of wisdom we revere, or did he possess a darker side that ancient writers and later historians chose to obscure? Why was the truth about him shrouded for over 2 millennia? And what forces, political and philosophical, drove Athens to condemn their most famous thinker to death? Let's peel back the layers of myth and explore why the real Socrates may have been hidden from view for 2,400 years. The enigmatic portrait of Socrates. Unlike many prominent figures of antiquity, Socrates left behind no writings of his own. What we know of him comes through the lenses of others, most notably Plato, Xenophon, Aristophanes, and later historians. This is where the first seeds of confusion and mythologizing were sown. Plato presents Socrates as a wise, almost saintly figure, relentless in his pursuit of truth and virtue. Xenophon's depiction is more conservative and practical, focusing on Socratic ethics. Meanwhile, Aristophanes, the comedic playwright, portrays Socrates as a ridiculous sophist, floating about in the thinkery, corrupting the youth and teaching bizarre natural philosophy. The result is a paradox. Socrates is both hero and villain, moral compass and societal threat. Over centuries, Plato's portrait gradually overshadowed all others, fixing Socrates in our collective imagination as the martyred champion of philosophy. Yet the historical record suggests reasons for suspicion, and for why his darker reputation might have been quietly buried. Socrates and the corruption of the youth. Central to the charges that led to Socrates' execution was the accusation that he corrupted the youth of Athens. But what did this mean? On the surface, it referred to encouraging young men to question tradition, religion, and political authority. Socrates was infamous for cross-examining prominent Athenians, exposing their ignorance and challenging established norms. In a democracy still reeling from political chaos, this made him deeply unpopular. But corruption of the youth also had a more sinister dimension. Socrates cultivated intimate circles of young aristocratic men, some of whom became deeply implicated in treacherous political acts. Among his students were Alcibiades, the charming yet notoriously unprincipled general, who defected to Sparta during the Peloponnesian War and played a role in disastrous campaigns that weakened Athens. Critias, who would become one of the 30 tyrants, a brutal oligarchic regime installed after Athens' defeat by Sparta. To many Athenians, Socrates seemed less a harmless philosopher and more a dangerous influence whose teachings inspired political sedition. If Athens wished to preserve democracy and stability, eliminating his influence may have seemed a tragic necessity. The political climate and the 30 tyrants. To fully grasp why Socrates was tried and executed, one must understand the turbulent context of late 5th century BCE Athens. The city had just endured the devastating Peloponnesian War, losing its empire, wealth, and prestige. In 404 BCE, the Spartans installed an oligarchic regime, the 30 Tyrants, who executed hundreds of citizens and ruled through terror. Critias, Socrates' former pupil, was among their leaders. After democracy was restored, Athens entered a period of fragile reconciliation. Yet memories of oligarchic atrocities were fresh. Socrates, with his open contempt for democracy and connections to oligarchs, was a symbol of everything many Athenians feared. When he stood trial in 399 BCE, the charges of impiety and corrupting youth served as thin legal veils over deeper political grievances. His refusal to abandon his methods during the trial, and his defiant attitude even when offered the chance to go into exile, sealed his fate. Socrates and religion, a threat to civic order? Another reason the truth about Socrates may have been obscured lies in his perceived religious heterodoxy. Athens was a deeply religious city. Public festivals, sacrifices, and rituals were intertwined with civic identity and political life. Socrates, however, was accused of denying the gods of the city, introducing new deities or divine voices, the daimonion, undermining religious piety among the youth. Plato insists Socrates was not an atheist, but rather a deeply spiritual man guided by an inner divine voice. Yet for many Athenians, his challenges to traditional belief amounted to religious subversion. This religious skepticism, paired with his habit of ridiculing prominent citizens, made him appear both impious and destabilizing. In a society where religion safeguarded political order, Socrates' philosophy was more than intellectual. It was politically dangerous. Why the darker story was buried. If Socrates truly posed such a threat, why has history remembered him so benignly? Several factors contributed to hiding the darker truths for centuries. 1. Plato's monumental influence. Plato was not merely Socrates' student. He was his public relations architect. Through works like the Apology, Crito, and Phaedo, Plato crafted an image of Socrates as the ultimate martyr for philosophy. He focused on Socrates' moral convictions and Stoic acceptance of death, overshadowing any political or social controversies. For philosophers and intellectuals in later generations, Plato's Socrates was too powerful a model to question. 2. The triumph of philosophy as an ideal. Over centuries, philosophy evolved into a noble pursuit of truth. The notion that its founding hero might also have been politically subversive or morally ambiguous became inconvenient for scholars who wanted philosophy respected in courts, churches, and universities. Highlighting Socrates' connections to oligarchs or political sedition risked tarnishing the entire philosophical tradition. 3. The simplification of historical narratives. History loves heroes and villains in stark relief. Nuanced figures like Socrates defy such simple categorization. It's far easier to remember Socrates as the noble truth seeker than to grapple with the idea that he might have helped sow the seeds of political catastrophe. 4. Later cultural needs. During the Renaissance and Enlightenment, Socrates was resurrected as a champion of reason against superstition and tyranny. Writers from Erasmus to Voltaire embraced his story as a rallying cry for free speech and intellectual liberty. Acknowledging his potential darker sides ran counter to the needs of thinkers fighting religious oppression and advocating democratic ideals. Socrates' philosophy, dangerous or liberating. Another reason the truth about Socrates stayed hidden for so long is that his ideas remain genuinely radical even today. He insisted that no one does wrong knowingly, which challenged legal and moral notions of punishment. He questioned the wisdom of the masses, implying that democracy might be inherently flawed if voters lacked knowledge. He declared that the unexamined life is not worth living, a notion that calls into question all blind obedience to tradition. These ideas can inspire deep personal and societal transformation, but they can also destabilize established systems. To conservative Athenians, Socratic questioning felt like philosophical dynamite placed beneath the city's foundations. Modern reevaluation. In modern scholarship, historians and classicists have begun to re-examine the real Socrates. Many now acknowledge that he was not politically neutral. He deliberately challenged democratic values and religious norms. He cultivated relationships with figures who undermined Athenian democracy. This doesn't make Socrates evil, but it complicates the narrative of a purely virtuous philosopher martyred by ignorance. He was a radical intellectual force, whose ideas could both enlighten and endanger his society. Why this matters today. So why should we care that the truth about Socrates was hidden for 2,400 years? Because his story reveals enduring tensions. Free speech versus social stability. Socrates' fate forces us to ask, when does questioning authority cross the line into sedition? Truth versus popularity. Should truth seekers defy the will of the people, even if it destabilizes society? Intellectual responsibility. Are thinkers responsible for how their ideas influence political events? These questions remain painfully relevant. From political whistleblowers to controversial public intellectuals, the world continues to wrestle with Socratic dilemmas. Socrates, hero, villain, or both. Few names in human history carry such a weight of reverence and controversy as Socrates. For many, he is the very embodiment of philosophical inquiry, a fearless seeker of truth, willing to die rather than betray his principles. For others, particularly in his own lifetime, he was a destabilizing influence, an arrogant questioner of tradition whose teachings sowed seeds of political turmoil. So who was he really? A hero, a villain, or a complex mixture of both? Exploring this question reveals not only the man himself, but the broader tensions between knowledge and society, free thought and social stability, and the perilous power of ideas. The traditional view, Socrates as hero. To begin, we must acknowledge how profoundly Socrates' image as a hero has shaped Western culture. Much of this heroic portrayal comes from Plato, his most famous student, who immortalized Socrates in dialogues like the Apology, Crito, and Phaedo. Here, Socrates appears as a moral exemplar who stands unwavering in his convictions, a courageous man who refuses to save himself through flattery or compromise, a champion of reason and intellectual honesty. His trial and execution in 399 BCE are often framed as the ultimate injustice, a martyrdom for free speech and philosophical inquiry. Socrates is remembered uttering words like, "The unexamined life is not worth living." Such lines echo through the ages, inspiring thinkers, artists, and reformers. The image of the wise, gentle sage facing death with serenity has become the archetype of philosophical heroism. The charges against Socrates. Yet even the traditional narrative admits that Socrates was executed by his own city, a democracy famed for its cultural achievements. Why? The official charges against him were impiety, not acknowledging the gods of Athens and introducing new divinities, corrupting the youth, encouraging young men to question authority, tradition, and religious norms. The Athenians saw in Socrates a man whose influence stretched beyond harmless talk. He challenged the foundations upon which society stood. Socrates the villain, dangerous ideas, and political chaos. To see why some Athenians viewed him as a villain, we must examine his historical context. Socrates lived through one of the most tumultuous periods in Athenian history. The Peloponnesian War devastated Athens economically and militarily. Democracy fell briefly to oligarchic coups led by the 30 Tyrants, a brutal regime responsible for political executions and purges. Athens struggled to re-establish democratic governance in the wake of social trauma. In this fragile environment, Socrates' activities seemed far more threatening than philosophical debates might appear today. Socrates and the 30 Tyrants. Perhaps the most damaging association was Socrates' link to figures like Critias, one of his former pupils and a leading member of the 30 Tyrants. Critias helped oversee bloody reprisals against democratic loyalists, confiscations of property, and executions. Another notorious associate was Alcibiades, an ambitious and charismatic Athenian statesman whose political intrigues and betrayals deeply undermined Athens during the war. While it's unfair to blame Socrates for the actions of his students, Athenians could not ignore the fact that prominent oligarchic conspirators had once sat at his feet. His tendency to disdain democracy as mob rule made it easier for critics to connect him to anti-democratic sentiments. Socratic questioning as subversion. In ancient Athens, public debate was central to democracy, but so was respect for civic norms and religious traditions. Socrates' relentless questioning often crossed the line into what many saw as social subversion. He ridiculed powerful citizens, exposing their ignorance. He challenged religious orthodoxy, even suggesting that the gods might be mere fictions or allegories. He questioned moral conventions, suggesting virtue depended on knowledge rather than tradition. For conservative Athenians, such ideas were not harmless musings. They were intellectual explosives, threatening the delicate balance of their society. Socrates and religion, piety or blasphemy. Religion and politics were tightly interwoven in Athens. Public rituals and beliefs were not merely private faith, but essential components of civic identity and stability. Socrates' insistence on his personal daimonion, a divine inner voice that guided him, seemed suspiciously like introducing new gods, which was illegal. His skepticism about traditional tales of the gods also cast him as impious. To the Athenians, questioning the gods was not simply philosophical curiosity. It was treason against the city's moral order. Plato's redemption of Socrates. Much of why we remember Socrates as a hero rather than a villain stems from Plato's writings. Plato's Socrates is calm and wise, a lover of truth above all else, unjustly condemned by a fearful, ignorant majority. Plato's dialogues transform the messy, human Socrates into a timeless figure, a symbol of intellectual courage and moral integrity. He becomes a philosophical Christ figure, executed for revealing uncomfortable truths. Plato's version of Socrates overshadowed alternative portraits, particularly those of Aristophanes or the political records of the time. The comic Socrates, Aristophanes' Clouds. Another piece of evidence for Socrates' more villainous reputation comes from Aristophanes' play The Clouds. Here, Socrates is portrayed as a buffoonish sophist, a corrupter of morals, a manipulator of clever but useless arguments. Aristophanes' comedic exaggerations painted Socrates as the sort of teacher who could convince young men to beat their fathers and deny the gods. While comedic, this reflects genuine public suspicion and distrust of philosophical speculation detached from social norms. Was Socrates guilty? A critical question arises. Was Socrates actually guilty of the charges against him? In the narrow legal sense, he probably did question traditional religion and encourage young men to challenge authority. He arguably did influence political radicals, though indirectly. But was this worthy of death? For many modern observers, The answer is no. Socrates was a victim of political fear and social turmoil. However, to Athenians traumatized by war, civic collapse, and political violence, his teachings could indeed look dangerous. His trial was as much a political statement as a legal proceeding, a warning that certain forms of intellectual subversion would not be tolerated. Socrates as both hero and villain. This brings us to the fascinating reality. Socrates was likely both hero and villain, depending on perspective. Hero. He pursued truth fearlessly. He lived in poverty and rejected material wealth. He refused to compromise his principles, even under threat of death. He inspired countless generations to question assumptions and seek wisdom. Villain. His relentless questioning threatened social cohesion. He showed disdain for democratic processes. He maintained relationships with oligarchs and political radicals. His teachings may have helped destabilize the fragile post-war democracy. Neither portrait tells the whole story. Socrates was a radical intellectual force whose ideas could enlighten and potentially disrupt an entire society. The philosophical paradox. One reason Socrates continues to fascinate us is the paradox he represents. Free inquiry is essential for truth. Free inquiry can also be deeply destabilizing. Socrates stood at the heart of this paradox. His heroism lies in his insistence that truth matters more than comfort or popularity. His villainy, in the eyes of many, lay in refusing to temper his philosophy for the sake of political harmony. This paradox remains intensely relevant. Today, we grapple with similar questions. When does free speech become dangerous speech? Should society tolerate ideas that might threaten its core values? Is intellectual provocation worth the risk of social upheaval? Socrates forces us to confront these tensions, and that's precisely why his story endures. Why the truth was hidden for centuries. For over 2 millennia, the darker sides of Socrates were largely forgotten. This was not accidental. Plato's influence. Plato's dialogues became foundational texts for philosophy. His portrayal overshadowed alternative perspectives. Later philosophical traditions. Philosophers and intellectuals needed a hero, not a political liability. Renaissance and Enlightenment. Thinkers embraced Socrates as a symbol of reason against religious or political oppression. Historical simplification. People prefer clear heroes and villains. Nuanced figures like Socrates defy easy categorization. Acknowledging Socrates' complexity requires confronting uncomfortable truths about philosophy's relationship to power and politics. Modern reevaluations. Contemporary scholarship increasingly embraces a nuanced view. Socrates was politically involved, even if indirectly. His criticism of democracy was real and significant. His moral philosophy had radical implications for social structures. Modern historians and philosophers explore Socrates not as a saint, but as a transformative and sometimes disruptive force. Socrates' enduring legacy. Ultimately, Socrates' genius lay in making people think. Whether seen as hero or villain, he forced his contemporaries, and us, to ask, what is justice? What is truth? What is a good life? He taught that wisdom begins with admitting ignorance. He showed that comfortable lies cannot replace honest inquiry. And he proved that sometimes pursuing truth demands paying the highest price. A heroic villain or a villainous hero. So, was Socrates a hero, a villain, or both? The answer depends on what one values. If one prizes truth above stability, Socrates is a hero. If one prizes social order above intellectual disruption, Socrates is a villain. But perhaps the real power of Socrates lies in the fact that he refuses to fit either category neatly. He was a profoundly human figure, driven by a relentless urge to question, and that, more than anything else, is why he continues to haunt our collective imagination. His life forces us to confront the price of free inquiry, the responsibilities of intellectuals, and the fragile balance between truth and the common good. In the end, Socrates may be best described not simply as a hero or villain, but as an enduring challenge to every society that claims to value wisdom and justice. Thanks for joining us on this journey into the hidden truths of Socrates, the man behind the myth. History often wears a polished mask, but digging deeper reveals the shadows lurking beneath even our greatest heroes. If you found today's revelations thought-provoking, don't forget to like, subscribe, and hit that notification bell so you won't miss our next dive into the secrets of the ancient world. What do you think about Socrates' dark side? Was he a misunderstood genius or a dangerous radical? Share your thoughts in the comments below. Until next time, keep questioning, keep exploring, and stay curious about the past.